The rifle was too wide for her hands. Nora knew this the moment she picked it up. The grip was built for something with longer fingers and more of them, 8, to be exact, arranged around a triple trigger housing that sat in the middle of the stock like a bad idea someone had approved anyway. She stood at the range and turned the weapon over once, twice, the way her grandfather used to turn a new tool before he trusted it. The range smelled like charged air and something faintly chemical she had no name for. Around her, 40 cadets were lifting their own rifles, HFY, mostly, with their long-jointed hands wrapping the stock exactly as it was designed to be wrapped. Precise. Clean. Every finger in its place. Nora's fingers were not in their places. She put her thumb forward along the receiver, pressed it flat against the body of the weapon the way she'd been doing since she was 9 years old, and her grandfather handed her something heavier than she expected and said breathe out first, then squeeze. Her wrist canted inward just slightly. The weight of the rifle settled into the heel of her palm, not the fingers. It looked, she knew, completely wrong. It felt like home. She didn't notice the quiet until it had already happened. One by one, the other cadets had stopped their own adjustments and were watching her. She could feel it without looking, that particular quality of attention that means someone has done something strange. The laugh came from her left. Vref, 8-fingered, standing 2 spots down the range, his pale angular face arranged into something that wasn't quite a smile on account of his species not really doing smiles the way humans understood them, but was close enough. He said something in HFY that she didn't catch. The cadet beside him made a low sound that translated well enough. Others followed. Not everyone, but enough. The range instructor, a lower-ranked HFY officer named Savek, walked toward her with the patience of someone who had corrected many things in his career and expected to correct many more. He stopped beside her, looked at her hands on the rifle, looked for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Your grip, he said, in the common tongue the Academy used for cross-species instruction, will result in accuracy deviation of up to 40%. Nora looked at the targets downrange. 5 of them, each the size of a dinner plate, set at varying distances. Well, all right then, she said. She shot all 5. Center mass, every one. The last one was the farthest, 60 meters, which wasn't far for most species on this range, but was far for a Varric pulse rifle in the hands of someone with the wrong grip, according to everyone present. It dropped clean. The range went quiet in a different way than before. Before was the quiet of amusement. This was the quiet of a room doing arithmetic it hadn't expected to do. Savek looked at the targets for a moment. Then he looked at Nora's hands again. He wrote something on his assessment board and walked away without saying anything else. Vref had stopped laughing. He was staring downrange. Whatever expression his face was making, it wasn't one she had a word for yet. Nora lowered the rifle. The weight came off her palm and she was aware, in the brief absence of it, that her hands were a little cold. The station recycled its air at a temperature that suited HFY physiology, which ran warmer than human. She was always slightly cold here and had stopped mentioning it after the first day. No one spoke to her for the rest of the session. That was fine. She'd had quieter silences pointed at her. This one at least had some respect buried in it, even if nobody was ready to show it yet. That night, in the barracks, Eli sat on the edge of his bunk and looked at her with the expression he always wore when he was deciding whether to say the thing or not say the thing. He was from Georgia, 27. He talked the way some people breathe, constantly, reflexively, as if silence were a condition to be managed. But he'd been learning, in the 2 weeks since they'd been assigned as bunkmates, when Nora's face meant don't. Her face meant don't. He said it anyway. You didn't tell them. She was pulling off her boots. She didn't look up. Tell them what? Where you learned to hold a gun like that. You could have just said. Said what? He paused. Thought about it. I don't know. Something. Something wouldn't have changed anything. She set her boots beside the bunk, heel to heel, the way her grandfather had always set his. They saw what they saw. Eli looked at his hands, then at hers. She had a small scar along the outside edge of her right palm, pale and slightly raised, running from the base of her pinky finger toward her wrist. He'd noticed it before and never asked. He didn't ask now. You grew up hunting, he said. It wasn't a question. She'd told him that much on the transport over. 2 sentences, no elaboration, no invitation to probe further. Yeah. And your grandfather taught you. Yeah. And that's the whole answer. Nora finally looked at him. There was something in her face that was almost fond, in the way that people who've carried things for a long time can still be fond of someone who hasn't. That's the whole answer, she said. Eli nodded. He lay back on his bunk and stared at the ceiling and did not ask any follow-up questions. She'd known he was smarter than he seemed. She cleaned the rifle alone. The rest of the cadets had finished and gone to the mess or the common room. The range was empty except for the hum of the station's filtration system and the faint pressure sound that lived behind everything on Varric 9, like the building itself was breathing carefully. She broke the weapon down the way Savek had shown them, cleaned each piece in the order he'd specified. It was different from what she was used to, different components, different tolerances, but the motion of it was the same. The patience of it was the same. When the rifle was back together, she set it on the bench and looked at it. Then she looked at her hands beside it. They were smaller than the weapon was designed for, calloused in the wrong places. The thumb that went forward along the receiver had a bend in the first joint from an old break that hadn't been set right. Her grandfather had taped it, told her it'd heal straight, and been mostly correct. She sat with this for a moment. Her hands against the rifle. Both of them on the same bench, belonging to different worlds. Not wrong, she thought. Just made differently. She put the rifle in the rack. Walked back to the barracks. Went to sleep. Outside the range window, the stars moved past in their slow, unchanging way, not caring what anybody's hands looked like or what they'd learned to hold. The academy had a way of compressing time. Weeks 2 through 5 moved like a river that didn't care what was in its way. Drills before breakfast. Qualification runs in the afternoon. Stress fire scenarios in the evenings, where the range lights would strobe and the floor would shift and the targets would move in patterns that weren't supposed to repeat but did, if you watched long enough. Nora watched long enough. She didn't always perform brilliantly. She knew this and didn't spend much energy worrying about it. Brilliance wasn't the point. She'd learned that young, from her grandfather, from the fields, from the particular education of lying still in cold grass waiting for something that might never come, which teaches you, eventually, that patience is just endurance with better posture. What she did instead of brilliant was consistent. The qualification gauntlet ran each cadet through 4 environments. Standard gravity. High G, low G, 0 G. Each species had an environment where they peaked and an environment where they fell apart. Cathare cadets, built for precision and stability, were extraordinary in standard gravity and became something closer to ordinary everywhere else. Their technique required a fixed platform, steady footing, controlled joint placement, no surprises. When the surprises came, they reset. Resetting took time. Time, in most of the scenarios, was the thing you didn't have. Under high G stress, Nora's numbers barely moved. Under 0 G, where most species dropped a full tier, she lost 2 percentage points. The assessment board logged it as an anomaly. Savek flagged it for review, added a note, and moved on. Vreth did not move on. He sat with Nora's numbers the way certain people sit with things that don't make sense, not to understand them, exactly, but to find the explanation that makes them manageable. He was methodical about it. He watched her during the 0G sessions, observed the way the thumb-forward grip behaved without a flaw to push against, and arrived, by the end of week 4, at an answer that satisfied him. He said it at dinner. The communal mess was loud enough that it should have been lost in the noise, but Vreth had a way of pitching his voice that cut through rooms cleanly. She isn't shooting precisely, he said, to the 3 Cathare cadets beside him, in the common tongue because Nora and Eli were 2 seats down and he wasn't hiding it. She's shooting around herself. The grip is a compensation mechanism. Her species lacks the joint articulation for correct technique, so they developed a workaround. The results look accurate, but the method is broken. The table agreed. It was a reasonable explanation. Vreth was usually right about reasonable explanations. Eli stared at his food. Nora put her fork down. She looked at Vreth for a long moment, long enough that he noticed, long enough that the table went slightly quieter, and then she picked her fork back up. "Well, all right then," she said, and went back to eating. Eli let out a breath. He'd been holding it without realizing. He found her in the corridor after dinner. She was walking like someone who'd already decided where she was going and didn't need company to get there, but he fell into step beside her anyway. "You should have said something," he said. "I did say something." That wasn't a real response, Nora." He basically called your whole technique a defect. He did call my whole technique a defect. And you just... She stopped walking, turned to look at him with an expression that was patient the way stone walls are patient. Not warm, but not unkind either. What would I have said, Eli? Explain to me exactly what I would have said that would have changed anything he thinks. He opened his mouth, closed it. People don't change what they think because you argue with them, she said. They change what they think because they see something they can't explain. And he saw it. He just found an explanation he likes better. She started walking again. That's fine. He's not wrong. He's not. The grip is a compensation. He's right about that. My grandfather's hands were bigger than mine, and his grandfather's hands were bigger than his, and somewhere a few thousand years back some person with a spear decided to wrap their thumb around the shaft instead of over it because the overgrip kept slipping in the rain. She said this the way people say things they've never actually said out loud before but have thought so many times the words come clean. Everything about how humans shoot is a compensation for something. We were cold, or tired, or it was dark, or something bigger than us was coming and we had one shot. She shrugged. Vretha's not wrong. I'm just not broken. Eli said nothing. He walked beside her back to the barracks, and he thought about his own hands, and what they'd learned to hold and why, and he felt something he couldn't quite name. Not quite pride, not quite grief, somewhere between the two. She was on the range at 4 in the morning. The station was quiet at that hour. The filtration system cycled down to its lower setting and the pressure hum dropped half a pitch. The lights went amber on the overnight protocol. It was the closest thing Varric 9 had to dark. She ran the moving target drill. 60 times. Her hands shook at first, not from fear, from cold, the way they always did at that temperature, and she let them shake, kept shooting anyway, because the shaking was also part of it, part of what the drill was for. By the 40th pass, the shaking had stopped. By the 60th, the targets were dropping in a rhythm that felt less like shooting and more like something her body was doing on its own, something older than thought. She didn't know she was being watched. Commander Ossel stood on the observation deck above the range, looking down through the ambulate dark at the small human woman running the drill alone at 4 in the morning. He watched her reload without looking at the mechanism. He watched the thumb settle forward along the receiver the same way every time, the wrist angle identical on every pass, the weight distribution so consistent it looked less like learned technique and more like anatomy. He watched her for 45 minutes. He did not speak. He did not make a note. He just stood at the observation window with his hands folded behind him and watched, the way someone watches something they want to understand before they say anything about it. When she finished and began cleaning the rifle, he turned and walked away down the corridor. His footsteps made no sound on the metal floor. In the range below, Nora broke the weapon down piece by piece in the amber dark, cleaned each component, reassembled the rifle, and set it in the rack. Her hands had stopped shaking. They were warm now, the kind of warm that comes from inside, from something working the way it was meant to. She walked back to the barracks through the quiet station. She didn't know anyone had been watching. It wouldn't have changed anything if she had. She'd been doing the work long before anyone was watching, and she would keep doing it long after everyone looked away. That was also something her grandfather had taught her, though he'd taught it without words, the same way he'd taught her most of the important things, by just showing up every morning and doing the work regardless of what the weather was doing or what anyone thought about it. She got into her bunk. Eli didn't stir. He slept like a man without complicated dreams, which she'd always thought was a gift. She closed her eyes. The station hummed around her, low and even. Outside, the stars were doing what stars do, burning without caring who was watching, keeping their distance, going on. She slept. The sim space smelled like burnt copper and stale recycled air, and the floor had a seam down the middle where the gravity plating switched from one setting to another, and everyone who'd run the scenario before had said, without exception, that it was the seam that got you. Not the strobing lights. Not the acoustic disruptors that made your inner ear feel like it was being stirred with a spoon. Not even the 47 mixed targets moving in patterns that had no pattern, friendlies and hostiles rotating through the same space in a way that punished anything less than full attention. The seam. That was the thing. You'd be midshot, stable, lined up, and then the gravity would shift beneath you. Not dramatically, not enough to throw you off your feet, but enough. Just enough to move the floor half an inch in a direction you weren't expecting. And if your technique required the floor to be where you thought it was, you were going to lose 2 seconds resetting. 2 seconds was the scenario's whole joke. 2 seconds in the timing architecture meant 3 friendlies registering as compromised. 3 compromised friendlies meant a failed extraction. A failed extraction was a failed scenario. The first 11 pairs had all failed on the seam. Some of them hadn't even made it to the halfway point. Nora and Vreth were last. The room knew what that meant. It was a pairing that someone with a sense of humor had arranged, or possibly someone without one. It was hard to tell, in the Academy's command structure, which one was responsible for what. But everyone watching through the observation glass understood the shape of it. The most technically correct cadet in the cohort, paired with the one who did everything wrong. They stood at the entry point in silence. Vreth had 8 fingers and a calm that came from having been right about things his whole life. He held his rifle in the standard grip, each finger in its designated position, the stock seated perfectly against his shoulder joint. He looked ready. Nora held hers the wrong way, as always. The scenario started. The lights dropped to combat low and immediately began strobing, not fast enough to blind, just fast enough to turn the world into a series of still images, a flipbook of a firefight. The acoustic disruptors engaged. Nora's back teeth ached with it. She moved left. Vreth moved right. They'd talked through their approach the night before, a single short conversation in which Vreth had explained his strategy with the thoroughness of someone briefing a colleague they didn't fully trust, and Nora had said okay and meant it. She cleared the first 2 targets in the opening corridor before Vreth had finished his first pass. Not because she was faster, because her first pass was different. She moved through the space the way water finds low ground, not stopping to set up each shot but adjusting mid-motion, the rifle an extension of something more continuous than a sequence of decisions. Then the gravity shifted. The seam ran directly under her left foot. She felt it, the familiar lurch of a floor that wasn't where it had agreed to be, and her body did what years of cold mornings and shaking hands and breathing out first had taught it to do. Nothing. It did nothing. It absorbed the shift the way old wood absorbs rain, not without feeling it, but without being altered by it. The thumb stayed forward. The wrist angle held. The barrel tracked the target through the lurch and past it. She fired. The target dropped. To her right, Vreth had stopped moving. 2 full seconds. She counted them without meaning to, while he planted his feet and reset his stance and found his platform again. He was precise about it. He was quick. But he was stopped. She was not stopped. She moved through the strobing dark and the disruptor noise with something that looked, from the observation window, less like a trained soldier running a qualified drill and more like someone who'd been here before. Not in this sim space. Not on this station. But here, in the place where the ground moves and the lights go wrong and something is coming and you have 1 shot and there is no one to help you and you shoot anyway. Her accuracy at the midpoint check was 91%. By the time the scenario ended, she had cleared 31 of the 47 targets. 9 hostiles.
No friendlies compromised.
Final accuracy, 94. The scenario room went quiet. Not the quiet of amusement, like week 1. Not the quiet of recalibration, like after the first range session. This was the quiet of people looking at a number and not knowing what box to put it in. 94%. Under strobing light, acoustic disruption, variable gravity. 94. Vreth walked out of the sim space and stood in the debrief corridor for a moment. He was looking at his hands. Nora came out behind him and he didn't look up. She was breathing normally. Her hands were warm, the inside warm from something working right. She leaned against the wall and waited because she knew from experience that there was usually something on the other side of a silence like this. After a long moment, Vreth said, "I don't understand how you held position through the gravity shift." He said it to the floor, not to her. But he said it. Nora thought about the frozen field. Her grandfather's voice in her ear. The particular dark of an Ohio winter morning before the sun had committed to rising. She thought about it the way you think about something when you're deciding how much of it to give away. Practice, she said. It wasn't a lie. It was the truest one-word answer she had. Vreth finally looked up. Something in his face was different, not softened, exactly. More like a frame that's been taken off a wall and hasn't been put back yet. She'd seen that expression on people before. It was the expression of someone whose best explanation has just run out. He didn't say anything else. She didn't need him to. The scores went up in the debrief room and the room looked at them in silence. Nora's name at the top of the Week 7 results board. The numbers beside it clean and specific and impossible to explain away. Sarvek marked something on his board. Vreth sat in the second row and looked at the numbers on the board and did not look at Nora. Eli, who was in the back row because he had finished his own scenario 2 hours earlier with middling results he was completely at peace with, looked at Nora's numbers and made a sound that was probably a laugh, quickly converted into a cough when the Kethiare cadet beside him turned to look. Nora sat in the front row and looked at her scores and felt nothing in particular. The number was right. She'd known what she'd done in the sim space. She didn't need a board to tell her. What she was thinking about was the seam in the floor. The half-inch shift in a direction the floor wasn't supposed to go. She was thinking about how many times something had shifted in a direction it wasn't supposed to go, and how each time, without planning it, without deciding to be ready, she'd been ready anyway. She was thinking that this was not a skill anyone had taught her directly. It was a skill that had been taught to her by everything that had ever tried to knock her over. She was still thinking about it when the debrief ended and the room began to empty. She stayed in her seat a moment longer. Above the door, through the small viewport that looked out into the station's outer ring, a piece of open space was visible, black and deep and full of things that had no idea she existed. She stood up. Walked out. The stars, as always, didn't care. But the number on the board stayed where it was. And numbers, unlike stars, have to be answered for. Commander Ossel had a face that made it difficult to tell how old he was. This was not unusual for the Kethiare senior staff. Their species aged in a way that didn't track to anything humans recognized, accumulating years the way stone accumulates pressure, invisibly, until one day something cracked and you understood there had been enormous force behind it all along. Ossel sat at his evaluation desk and did not look ancient, exactly, but he looked like the kind of person who had long since stopped being surprised by things. The individual evaluations ran in order of cadet ranking. Nora was last. She sat outside his office on a bench along the corridor wall and listened to the station. It had sounds she'd come to know by position. The higher hum was the starboard filtration system. The intermittent knock was a thermal coupling that nobody had gotten around to fixing in what she suspected was years. Little sounds that a person collects when they spend enough time in one place paying attention. The door opened. The cadet before her came out, nodded, moved on. She went in. Ossel's office was spare. A desk. 2 chairs. A viewport to the station's outer ring where, depending on the time of rotation, you could sometimes see the edge of Earth in the distance, pale and blue and unaware of being watched. The viewport was dark at this hour. She sat down across from him. He had her assessment file on the desk, but he didn't open it immediately. He looked at her for a moment in the way he always looked, the way someone looks when they're taking the full measure of something before they speak. She was used to being measured. Most people concluded wrong. She waited. He opened the file. He went through it in the procedural way that the evaluations required. Scores, drill logs, the written assessment from Sarvek, the anomaly flag on the multi-environment qualification. She answered his questions with short answers because that was what the questions asked for. Yes, the 0G numbers were hers. No, she hadn't used a secondary grip at any point. Yes, the same technique throughout. Then he pulled up the scenario footage. He watched it without speaking. She watched him watch it. When it reached the moment of the gravity shift, the seam, her left foot, the barrel tracking through without interruption, he paused it. He zoomed in on her hands. He stayed there for a while. Long enough that the silence in the room became a kind of weight, like pressure building in a system before something releases. "Where did you learn to hold a weapon this way?" he said. It wasn't quite a question. It had the shape of one, but the tone of something that already knows the answer isn't going to be simple. Nora thought about what she'd told Eli and the version she'd told herself and the version she'd never said out loud to anyone. She looked at Ossel's face and decided he'd earned the real one. "My grandfather," she said. "We had land outside Columbus. A few acres. He took me hunting for the first time when I was 6, and he said the most important thing he could teach me was how to stay calm when something goes wrong, because in the field something is always going wrong." Ossel said nothing. She continued. "He had big hands. The overgrip worked fine for him. But my hands were small and the overgrip slipped, so he showed me the thumb forward position because it distributed the weight differently. He said it was something his grandfather had shown him. He didn't know where it came from before that." She paused. This was before the expansion changed things. Before hunting became more complicated. She said those words, asterisk before the expansion asterisk, The way people say words that hold a lot of weight they're not going to explain. We just went out in the mornings, in the cold, and he taught me what he knew. Ossel looked at her hands on the desk. They were still. She wasn't a person who fidgeted. The technique predates formal military instruction, he said. Yes. It was developed for practical conditions. Cold.
Variable terrain.
Physical stress. I suppose so. We just called it how to hold a gun. He closed the footage. He folded his hands on the desk and looked at her in the way that had no category. Not quite evaluation, not quite something else, something she didn't have a word for yet. Then he said it. Not loudly. Not for the room. They were the only ones in it. He said it quietly, the way a person says something they've been thinking for a while, the words already worn smooth from being turned over in private. Only Earthborn can shoot like that. Nora sat very still. The rest of us, he said, never had to learn how to die slowly enough to get good at surviving it. The room was quiet. She knew, somewhere under the quiet, that something important had just happened. Not a compliment. That wasn't the shape of it. More like being identified. Like a thing that had been placed in the wrong category getting moved into the right one after a long time in the wrong box. It should have felt like winning. It didn't. Quite. It felt closer to the way it feels when someone says your name correctly after everyone else has been saying it wrong. Not triumph, just relief. And something older than relief. Something with more weight. She didn't stand straighter. She didn't feel her chin come up the way people do when they are acknowledged. She sat in the same chair, the same posture, the same still hands on her knees. Thank you, sir, she said. He nodded once. The evaluation was over. She stood up. Walked to the door. Paused with her hand on the frame. She didn't turn around. My grandfather's name was Louis, she said. He died the year before I shipped out. I didn't. She stopped. Stopped and didn't continue, because there was nothing to add that the sentence didn't already carry in the space it left open. Anyway. She walked out. Eli was in the corridor. He'd been waiting, which was typical of him. He worried like it was a second job, and waiting outside closed doors was one of the ways he did it. He looked at her face. He was, by now, good at reading her face. He'd had 7 weeks of practice and the kind of close-quarters attention that bunkmate situations enforce whether you want them to or not. He'd learned that the absence of expression was different from a good expression, and that her silences had textures if you knew how to feel for them. He looked at her face now and didn't ask. He fell into step beside her and they walked back toward the barracks in silence, and the silence was the kind that two people build together when they've been in the same hard place long enough to know what the other one doesn't want to say. Vreth was in the corridor too. He was standing near the intersection where the evaluation wing met the main passage, and she didn't know if he'd been waiting there or had just happened to be passing. His face was arranged in the careful neutral he used when he was processing something. He looked at her as she came down the corridor. He looked at her hands. Then he looked at the wall beside the corridor intersection, and then at the floor, and then he walked past her in the other direction without speaking. She watched him go. Then she kept walking. The corridor was long and quiet, and the thermal coupling knocked twice somewhere behind the wall. She walked the length of it beside Eli, who kept his silence all the way to the barracks, which was the kindest thing he'd done in 7 weeks. She lay down on her bunk and stared at the ceiling and thought about her grandfather's name in the air of that office. She'd never said it here before. She hadn't planned to say it then. She thought, Louis. The way he'd said breathe out first, then squeeze. The way his hands had looked on a rifle in the field at dawn, certain and unhurried, like a man with all the time in the world even when he didn't have any. She thought about what Ossel had said. Die slowly enough to get good at surviving it. She turned it over once. Twice. Set it down. Closed her eyes. Outside the viewport, somewhere in the dark, Earth rotated in its slow and private way, not waiting for anyone's permission, not asking for anyone's understanding, just going on. As it had always gone on. As it intended to keep doing. The departure ceremony wasn't much of a ceremony. The academy ran things practically. You did your quarter, you got your marks, you found out which track you were moving into, and then you went. There was a gathering in the main hall where Commander Ossel read names from a list, while cadets stood in their rows and the ventilation system hummed its usual indifferent hum and the overhead lights did what overhead lights do. That was the ceremony. Nobody had given Nora a reason to expect anything different, So she stood in her row with her hands loose at her sides and listened to names being called, and the whole thing moved at the pace of a Tuesday afternoon, which was fine. Ceremony had never been something she needed. 3 specialty tracks were announced: Technical Division, Field Operations, Advanced Combat Integration, the cross-training program, the one designed to take cadets from different species and run them through each other's techniques. The theory, as Sarvek had explained it in week 3, was that watching how another species holds a weapon tells you something about how they think, about what they are afraid of, about what they've learned to survive. Nora had listened to this in week 3 and thought, that sounds right. Usul began reading the names for the advanced track. The first name was a Kethara cadet from the northern cohort she didn't know well. The second name was Eli, which surprised nobody more than Eli himself. She heard the small startled sound he made from 3 rows back and almost smiled. The third name was hers. The fourth was Vreth. The room processed this information in its various ways. The Kethara cadets in Vretha's row shifted slightly, which for them was the equivalent of a much larger reaction. A few of the other species made sounds she didn't have translations for. Eli made the sound again, the one that was definitely a laugh this time, not bothering to cover it. She looked straight ahead. Vreth stood 2 rows to her left. She could see him in her peripheral vision. He went still when his name was called, not the stillness of surprise but the stillness of someone receiving information they're sorting in real time. His 8 fingers were at his sides. They closed briefly around nothing, a small reflexive motion, and then opened again. She thought, he's never been paired with something he couldn't categorize before. This is what that looks like. She looked straight ahead and let him sort. After the hall cleared out, the cadets moving in their various directions with their various purposes, she found the observation deck at the end of the station's outer ring. It was a small space, mostly glass, designed for looking out at the deep dark between stars. During the day shift, cadets used it to decompress. At this hour, it was empty. She sat on the bench along the curved wall and looked out. Earth was in the viewport tonight. Not close, it was never close, but visible, small, and lit from one side by a sun that was just a brighter dot among the others from this distance. Blue and white. Smaller than she'd expected it to look, the first time she'd seen it from up here. Then smaller again once she got used to it. Then, eventually, the right size. She looked at it for a long time. She thought about Usul's words, which she'd been turning over for 2 days now without wearing them smooth. They kept catching on something, kept meaning more than the last time she'd held them up. Asterisk die slowly enough to get good at surviving it. Asterisk she knew what he meant. She'd known as soon as he said it, in the way you know something that's been true about you before someone gives you the words for it. Humans were not the biggest species. Not the strongest. Not the most precise, or the fastest, or the ones with the best eyesight or the most durable joints or the highest pain threshold. They were the ones who had been cold and hungry and outmatched for most of their existence on a planet that hadn't been built with them specifically in mind, and they had kept going anyway. Not through any single talent. Through the accumulated stubbornness of a species that didn't know when it was supposed to stop. The grip was part of that. The small compensations. The 1,000 tiny adaptations that built up over generations until they stopped looking like adaptations and started looking like just how you did things. She looked at her hands in the viewport glass, reflected against the stars. Small. Calloused in the wrong places. The bent first joint on the right thumb, the pale scar along the outside edge of the right palm. Hands that had learned what they knew from hands that had learned it before them, going back further than she could trace. She didn't feel proud of this, exactly. Pride wasn't the right word. Pride was for things you'd chosen. She hadn't chosen this. She'd inherited it, the way you inherit a piece of land, not because you earned it, but because you came from the people who worked it, and working it had shaped you whether you knew it or not. What she felt was particular. Specific. Like something that had a precise location in the world rather than a general one. She watched Earth rotate slowly out of the viewport's frame, taking its blue light with it until the glass was just stars again. She sat there a moment longer. Then she went to bed. The range was empty at that hour. This was the thing about the Academy's overnight protocol. The amber lights, the lowered hum, the quiet that collected in the training spaces like water in a low place. Vreth had noticed this in the first week and catalogued it as information with no current application. Now he walked into the empty range and stood at the bench in the amber half-dark. He picked up a Varric pulse rifle. He held it in the standard grip. 8 fingers, each in its designated position, stock seated correctly against his shoulder joint. He held it for a moment in the way he held everything, with confidence in the arrangement, certainty that the thing was done correctly. He set it down. He tried the other grip. Thumb forward along the receiver. He knew what it was supposed to look like. He'd watched Nora do it enough times that the image was clear. But knowing what something looks like and making your body do it are two different kinds of knowledge, and his 8 fingers did not want to sit the way 4 fingers and a thumb were supposed to sit. The geometry was wrong. His joints moved differently. The weight of the rifle distributed in a way that felt unstable, unresolved, like a sentence that doesn't find its end. He tried again. Slower this time. More deliberately. Still wrong. He set the rifle on the bench and looked at his hands. 8 fingers. Pale and long and articulated at 5 joints each, built for precision the way a good instrument is built for precision, to do exactly what it was designed to do, in exactly the way it was designed to do it, and to do it perfectly every time. He looked at them for a long time. He thought about the sim space, the seam in the floor, the 2 seconds he had lost while she had not lost any. He thought about her numbers on the board and the 40 mornings she had spent on the range before the station woke up. He thought about what she'd said to him in the debrief corridor. *practice. He had understood it then as deflection, too simple an answer for what he'd seen. He understood now that he'd been wrong. Not because it was the whole truth. Because it was the most honest kind of partial truth, the one that points towards something it won't fully say. He picked up the rifle again. Tried the grip again. Still wrong. Still the wrong geometry, still the weight in the wrong place, still the joints arguing with the position they were being asked to hold. He tried it a 3rd time. Held it there. Felt the wrongness of it. He set the rifle down carefully, the way you put something down when you're thinking about it rather than when you're finished with it. He looked at his hands on the bench beside the rifle. 8 fingers open on the dark surface. The shape they made. The shape they couldn't make. The range was quiet around him. The amber lights. The hum of the filtration system somewhere behind the wall. He stood there for a long time, in the dark, in the quiet, with the rifle and his hands and the shape that wouldn't come, and whatever he was thinking, he kept it to himself. There was nobody there to see it, which was its own kind of answer.